how collaborating across multiple disciplines is crucial when purchasing a distressed business. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce our panel of experts. So we have Joseph Schwartz. He's chair of Riker Danzig's Bankruptcy and Corporate Restructuring Group, has over 25 years of experience in commercial bankruptcy and state court insolvency matters with a focus on commercial restructurings and corporate reorganizations. Joe is the current president of the New Jersey Turnaround Management Association and also serves on the ABI Mid-Atlantic Bankruptcy Advisory Board. Joe is recognized in 2022 by Law Dragon as one of the 500 leading bankruptcy and restructuring lawyers in the US. Joe, welcome. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And nothing like putting pressure on me by calling this an expert panel, but we'll go from there.
Agreed.
We know that the results will live through and you'll live up to the hype. So we're confident in that. We have Sharon Bender. She's a managing director at Webster Bank. After graduating from the Rutgers MBA program, she pursued a career in banking and joined Webster Bank in the corporate finance group, where she was reunited with some of her former colleagues and returned to the hybrid product asset-based lending with a cash flow component. Sharon is able to work with a variety of debt funds, private equity groups, and of course, an entrepreneur through a direct deal. So Sharon, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
And our final panelist today is Jeffrey Kates. He is on our board for the New Jersey EPI and is a partner in the Founders Group. He is also the president and owner of JIK Consulting, which is a business advisory service firm that specializes in workouts and turnarounds, interim CFO work, and mergers and acquisitions. Jeffrey, welcome to the call. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, our moderator for today, Melvyn Peters, Vice President at DAC Group. He helps support DAC's middle market business clients as they navigate the M&A landscape. His role as Vice President, he combines in-depth financial analysis experience and comprehensive industry knowledge to identify value and opportunity for clients. So with that, I wanted to hand it over to Melvyn as moderator for the discussion.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that introduction. And appreciate everyone who's on the call today. Looking forward to giving Joe, Sharon, and Jeff an opportunity to share some of their expert knowledge and hopefully help you as you help your clients potentially buy a distressed business. So with that being said, I think it would be great to just kick off with an overview and really discussion on the spectrum of different distressed business opportunities. And Joe, given your role working with companies that are, looking to acquire businesses that are either in bankruptcy, out of bankruptcy, might be healthy, but showing signs of distress. What does the opportunity landscape look like?
So I think that when you're representing, whether it's a buyer, whether it's a seller, you have to look at things, look at that and try to determine the level of stress and distress. Because, is there a covenant default? Is there a payment default? Is there a lawsuit? Are you on the verge of, a foreclosure or a repossession of collateral, things like that. And so from a buyer's perspective, for example, you have to understand the situation, because is this a melting ice cube? Is this a situation where you have to move really quickly? And there's various opportunities, there's various types of strategies that one can use, both from the debtor / target's perspective versus a buyer. And buyers often dictate, what that is going to look like if the assets are going to be sold. Sometimes you have time and you can do this out of court. There's some advantages or disadvantages, in the way you look at things from doing things out of court. There's things like Article 9 foreclosures, where a secured creditor is selling the assets through an Article 9 foreclosure process. And then there's, in court sales of distressed assets. And those are things like bankruptcy sales, whether it's in Chapter 11 or whether it's in Chapter 7. There's insolvency proceedings in state court, assignments for the benefit of creditors and things like that. Chapter 11 presents opportunities to preserve going concern value. Whereas sometimes, like I said, you're in a melting ice cube situation and there's no liquidity and things like that. And so, this has to go directly to a liquidation scenario. And so either Chapter 7 or an assignment for the benefit of creditors is the right play here. Again, you have to determine the situation and whether the assets are deteriorating rapidly. There's operational capability, the burn rate, et cetera. But I think that the most important thing is that whether you are a debtor, whether you are a potential purchaser, you have to hire experienced professionals. I think that's the most important thing, because many times clients come to my office and it's 11:59 and the ship is about to sail and there's not enough time to come up with a good strategy. So I think the earlier a client can hire professionals, and when I talk about professionals, you obviously need experienced professionals who understand all the different facets that I just discussed.
Sure. Great way to kick off, Joe. And to follow up on that, Jeff, from your broad experience working on the consulting side, on the company side, but also on the buy side, what are some of the areas that you see as potential opportunities?
Thanks, Melvyn. I don't know if I can follow Joe. I think we're done after that. I think the whole session was just taken care of.
He called us experts, so I had to say something.
Right. So I think it's important to look at, building on what Joe said, is based on the situation you're in. I mean, if you're looking at that target, there are probably opportunities that you've already identified, right? And sometimes the opportunity, if it's been strategically looked at, is so great that it doesn't matter what the risks are, right? So whether it's in if it's debtor in possession, if we're doing an ABC, or it's just a we're doing a turnaround and it's before bankruptcy, it's really about the opportunity. But certainly what needs to be looked at from the buy side is the earlier you plan, if you have that ability to plan for what your day one is going to look like post-close, that's really important with regards to where you're at today is, and Joe touched on this, is where are we with customers, vendors, if it's a manufacturing company with these cash constraints, running a business in distress is much different than running a business day to day that's turning its own cash. So to build on what Joe said with regards to the advisors, I couldn't agree more, because there are so many people that need to be involved, and it's an expensive proposition, but you need somebody like Joe, there's tax people, bankers like Sharon, there should be a CFO or COO that really understands how to run a business in distress, and there may be peripheral players as well. So with regards to opportunities, hopefully they've been identified. With regards to risks, there are many, and I'm sure we're going to get into that a little later. So
yeah, and that's a great segue to, I think, the lender perspective, because a lot of times lenders, especially on the bank side, are really thinking about minimizing the downside, especially when looking at buy side opportunities, especially with distressed businesses or businesses that might go into distress. So Sharon, from your perspective, curious to hear how you look at these opportunities and what some of the opportunities are from the banking perspective, but also areas of concern.
We actually at Webster have a box for distressed lending. So if a prospect comes to us and says, we have this company, it's been losing money, we have a box that says we can do debt coverage below 1 times based on the assets. The valuation of the assets, though, has to be healthy in relation to what the prospect wants to draw on. So, for example, you would have to have enough availability under the revolving credit to cover the burn rate for 1 year. People think that a turnaround will take 6 months. I've been doing this for a lot of years. I've never seen a turnaround with 6 months. It'd be great to see it, but they usually take 9 months to 1 year to implement all the changes that Jeff just talked about. In addition, as a banker, you are only as good as our third-party advisor. So we would hire, we want a very good CPA to be doing a review or audited statement. We want to have a good field exam firm look at the collateral. We want good appraisals. And the other thing we want for people like Jeff is we need good projections. So Jeff does typically a 13-week cash flow projection. We're going to need a 3-year projection, and that projection will have to have text. So many people, even with typical ABL deals, just give me the numbers. And I'm like, this isn't enough. I really need to see why you are saying that sales are going to increase. And that I can accept. I'm a marketer, so I will always be the optimistic one that sales will increase. What I do always think is, gee, why is the gross margin improving? Why was it not so great last year? Was it maybe 12%, and next year it's going to be 17%? And then the same with the SG&A margin. Why does that improve? The debt service is easy for us to figure out, but it's the ins and outs. And for that, we need somebody who is willing to spend an extensive amount of time figuring it out. The other thing that I caution people who are buying companies is don't be cheap. Go with the best advisors that you can go with. Go with the best CPA. Go with the best people who can do the job, because otherwise it's penny wise and dollar foolish later on. And these people will help you as the company transitions. So as you transition from this company is in distress to this company is doing okay, these are the people who you could give a quick phone call to, even though they, you've paid their fee or whatever, they're always willing to help you out later on. And that's almost endearing, because even I call them and say, what do you think? And they're always helpful. They never say, gee, I've had my retainer and now I'm not going to help you. I've never had that in all the years. So hire good people to do this, because it is complicated.
Hey, Sharon, can I just piggyback on that, Melvyn? Is not only, and that's great advice, Sharon, by the way, but not only based on, on cost and value, it's also how well everybody collaborates. Because as you get closer to a deal close, you're literally dealing with stuff, every 30 minutes. And so working together to come up with the best solution, whether it's, how do you marry the tax issue with the operational issue, with the credit issue, with the actual document that's being drafted, and things, as you get closer to a deal, you are in touch with all parties all day long. And so getting people that collaborate well together is also really important, because nobody can do it all by themselves. So.
Right.
It's a great point, Jeff. And I think in our work at DAC with distressed businesses, as you get closer to closing, you want everyone to truly be in lockstep. And I think it's a good segue to asking Joe a question, just in terms of, Joe, when you say get an opportunity and you're asked, how do you, or who do you recommend? How do you go about doing that? And then how does that weigh into your thoughts on opportunity versus risk, especially when considering the different types of acquisition vehicles like bankruptcy sales or out of court sales or sales in state court?
Yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to Sharon and Jeff, and I agree with everything they're saying. But at the same time, in my business, things usually happen pretty quickly. Like I said earlier, you're faced with a situation where the situation is deteriorating. There's not necessarily an opportunity for a lot of due diligence. There's not necessarily a situation where you can spend a lot of time doing financial analyses. I mean, certainly, when you're doing an out of court restructuring, that's one thing. But when you're doing a sale, that might be a different thing, because, that usually happens fairly quickly. I mean, hopefully clients come to you early in the process and you can do a full-fledged and fulsome, marketing, and you can, essentially market the assets, and you have the liquidity to do so, et cetera. But, like I said, while getting experienced professionals is certainly really important, a lot of times you don't have the luxury of time. And so things like historical financial data and operational results, might mean little in terms of the future of the business from a buyer's perspective, because the buyer is looking at a situation that's deteriorating. They have to determine whether, from a strategic perspective or otherwise, they want to acquire these assets or this business, whether it's a stock sale, whether it's an asset sale. Those are all other considerations that need to be considered. and there's tax reasons for doing it. There's liability reasons for doing, different types of sales and purchases. But, a prospective buyer has to adjust its expectations, especially if there's a bankruptcy scenario, and its due diligence process and its risk tolerance, from levels that if it was buying a healthy business, because these risk levels, while there's opportunities out there, they certainly have to be adjusted somewhat in a distressed situation. Again, plus given the time constraints and abbreviated timelines, especially if you're talking about bankruptcy, a prospective buyer, has to be able to move quickly, has to have a strategy, whether it wants to be the stalking horse bidder. There's a lot of protections in bankruptcy that a buyer can get. There's certain things that the buyer can do to elevate its position and have its bid, have priority over things, and we can talk about that, if you like. But again, I think that from my perspective, getting people who are good but are have to work quickly and be faced with perhaps limited financial data, and another thing is that the buyer might have a limited opportunity to speak with the management team of the target, because the management team is being pulled in so many different directions. And so whether it's from a due diligence standpoint, whether it's from an informational standpoint, I think that they have to move quickly. If I was representing a bank and there's a covenant default or something, then I certainly agree with Sharon's perspective on things. But in my experience, I do represent banks, and I agree with Sharon 100% of what she said. But in my experience, a lot of times if you're representing a company or you're representing a buyer, you don't have the luxury of time.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in terms of how time can really affect, make or break a deal, especially if there's, as you said, Joe, earlier, a melting ice cube situation going on. One question from the crowd, from Kevin Roche, and this is to everyone, but perhaps Sharon could kick off on it. Do you ever negotiate with the lenders when buying the business, or do you buy the business and the market value or book value to assume their debt?
That is DAC every day, all day. That's where I would rely on you, Melvyn, because you would be negotiating with the lenders. So that is, when I said about going to the trusted advisors for help, right there. If something came in on an appraisal where we thought the M&E was worth $5 million and it came in at $3 million, you would be the one to know first. You would be my first phone call.
Sharon, that is a glowing review, and I will not forget the testament there. And I guess, Joe, from your perspective, being so involved, especially as it relates to the letter of the law with some of these agreements which are getting negotiated, if you're on the buy or the sell side, what do you typically look at as the triggers to try to get some leverage to essentially negotiate better terms?
You're talking about to negotiate terms with the lender? Is that what you're talking about?
The lender's taking a haircut. That's what it's asking.
I think that you need to look at things like the valuation is really important, because in a bankruptcy situation, you could definitely play with the lender in the sense that under bankruptcy, if that's the route you were going, the lender's secured claim could be reduced depending on the value of the collateral and things like that. And so there's a lot of leverage and a lot of, quote, threats that you could make in order to bring the lender to the table. But I think the best advice is generally to communicate with your lender if you're representing a debtor, for example, because you want to go into, whether it's a bankruptcy or whether it's an out of court restructuring, you want to go forward on a cooperative basis. You don't want to be fighting with your lender if you could avoid that. But there certainly are leverage points with respect to lenders, because lenders can be strung out in bankruptcy. Lenders can be their claims can be reduced. I mean, lenders in turn have leverage points back, and there's a lot of give and take. But you certainly the threat of bankruptcy presents opportunities. Bankruptcy is a tool that can be used. And years ago, when I first started this many years ago, a lot of companies would come to me and say, the stigma of bankruptcy is terrible, but it's really a legal tool. And, I don't think the stigma that of bankruptcy is what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but, it is a legal tool that is to be used, in the appropriate situations. And the threat of bankruptcy is a tool as well.
If I can add something, and I've represented banks on the sell side and also the buy side, and lender fatigue is a very real issue, for banks. And also, if there's a way for buyers to understand and find out what the reserve is on the on the account as well, that's always, when you're dealing with owners of businesses, and to Joe's point, is bankruptcy is a leverage. Even though you're negotiating with the lender directly, the actual owner of the business, even though it's in distress, still has some say in this, even though they're up against the wall. Probably they have no, their collateral's gone. Who knows where they're at? But there's definitely lender fatigue, and certainly open dialogue is available between all parties when it comes to that, I would say.
Okay, we've got another one before we move on from this topic from Bert Well. Thank you, Bert. Ask Sharon, will a bank ever disclose a level of internal reserve?
Probably
No.
not.
No, in fact, I think
Never.
David Stein is on this, is one of the participants, and he represented me in a bankruptcy, and we collected every dime. And remember, usually if it's an entrepreneur, there's a personal guarantee. And don't think the bank is going to just say, oh, we'll collect on the assets. No, we're going to use the personal guarantee probably as a leverage to try to collect as much as we want. And that's the open dialogue. So the advisor, like Melvyn and you, Jeff, would be saying to the buyer, tread lightly here, because the more they like you, the more they will do for you. But if you get on the wrong side of a bank, because they're irritated already by lender fatigue, and they want to collect. And that's why using a lawyer who is like, using Riker Danzig, using David Stein, using the best of the best is what you need to do. You don't want to go to a one-man firm for something like this. It's too complicated. There's too many facets. And dealing with the bank, sometimes feels like a full-time job for people. And then it ends, and then you go on to the next issue, which might be taxes. But it keeps going and going. It's a long process. Everybody on this phone call knows that, because you all do this.
Yeah. So taking a step in a slightly different direction, let's talk a little bit about due diligence, because being on the buy side, the seller and the seller's counsel and advisor are going to do probably some window dressing. There might be some creative adjustments that you see, or ways of looking at the business. Jeff, from your perspective, having worked specifically on the side of the companies, what do you see as kind of the major areas of due diligence that you focus on? And I guess from a financial perspective, how do you look at businesses when they're under distress?
And I'm going to preface this by saying, to Joe's point, it always depends on how much time you have, right? And so I'll answer this from the perspective of there's a little more time than the melting ice cube scenario, and you have a bit of time to get into this and figure it out. And really, what, in my opinion, the strategy is always, where are we at today, but where are we going to be the day we take over this business? And so you're dealing with a due diligence on both a financial and an operational front. So from an operational perspective, I would say you've got to focus on your customers and sales. And if you have the ability, because you may not, based on NDA, I've been in due diligences where the buyers had the ability to talk to customers, and I've been in due diligences where they didn't. But certainly being able to understand the status of the backlog of sales orders, understanding where you're at so that on day one, you can be up and running as best as possible. Same with the vendors. Who do you have on your side? How are you going to manage being able to keep supplies moving, under cash constraints? And of course, you will have projected that out and hopefully spoken to them. You want to look at, if it's a manufacturing facility, what's the status of the equipment and the process and on the lines, and do you have the materials? So if there's a bill of materials and you have 80% of the materials and you don't have that last 20%, what happens to your production? And if it's all system generated and you're in a turnaround situation, it's not business as usual. So certainly on an operational side, you're dealing with all of those things. On the financial side, you're probably building, I think Melvyn raised this point before, maybe it was Joe, that you may not have the historical financial information. So the best you're gonna do is build a balance sheet and a P&L as to where you're at on that day with what you can, but you gotta build something to forecast out, at recognizing that it may not be perfect. And of course, to Sharon's point about the cash flows, you have to do a 13-week cash flow and really understand where your sources of cash are coming and where the money's going out. Understanding that you may, depending on what financing is brought to the table, you may be in COD, you may open up the line. So all that has to be figured out in due diligence. And then the other piece I would really add is the human capital piece, is have you strategically figured out how you're going to proceed on day one after the transition? Are you bringing everything in-house? Are you keeping the facility? Do you have the right people for it? Are there any A players at the target? So all that has to be analyzed during due diligence, just as a starting point.
And Jeff, one quick follow-up there, especially around the financial due diligence, because from our work at DAC and working with folks like you guys, it seems like the 13-week cash flow is kind of king, and everyone kind of wants to take a look at that. It's not always perfect, but why don't you explain to everyone exactly what that is and why it's important?
Sure. So if a 13-week cash flow is really done week by week, what it mimics is the company's operations. So you have to see where you're at, and you're in a 13-week cash flow, which is different than month to month, is you're really targeting your expenses by week because cash is king. So if a payroll is happening bi-weekly, you're going to have it in week 2 and week 4. If it's on the 15th and the 31st, you're going to have it. So you're going to go through all of the different expenses, understanding what kind of payables are on the books that have to be met, who you're going to give haircuts to or not. So all this has to be in week by week because you're reporting to the bank, you're reporting to everybody during this process, and accurate financial information is critical, not just to run the business, but to report to everybody. And there's a line of communication open during that time that the business is being well managed as they try and come out of that situation.
Great points, Jeff. And I agree. Communication is key, especially since you're trying to keep the lenders happy in an already precarious situation.
Yep.
As Joe, from your perspective on the legal side, what should buyers be doing as it relates to contingent liabilities, being aware of different nuances for different deals? How does the legal due diligence work stream change depending on the type of distressed asset that you're buying?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, it all depends on the situation. It all depends on the time frame and the state of the stress that the business is in. And I think that Jeff made some really good points there. From my perspective, if you're representing a buyer and if you have time and if you can do this over some period of time outside of a bankruptcy case or some other type of insolvency case, then certainly Jeff's points are really well taken. A lot of times, like I said earlier, you're not going to have the luxury of time. And so you have to do the best you can with the information because, again, you might not have access to all the information. You might not have access to the management team. You might not be able to do the due diligence that you would like to do it on a full scale. But you then look at that and you have the opportunity perhaps to dictate that this has to be run through a bankruptcy case. And there's protections that a buyer can get in a bankruptcy case. 363 sales allow for sales free and clear of liens, claims, encumbrances. And so, you could sanitize the assets and walk away from this. And so that minimizes risk to some extent. In contrast, there's in your APA, things like indemnities back from the seller, things like reps and warranties, things like that are usually not found in APAs that are in bankruptcy cases. And so, you might want to consider getting, rep and warranty insurance and things like that. But again, you will have, or you could, demand and hopefully get a sale free and clear if you're going through a bankruptcy case. And that's the benefit of bankruptcy versus some other things like out of court sales in a distressed situation, or even, ABC's, assignments for the benefit of creditors. You also could, I heard Jeff talking about other parties like, vendors or perhaps even contract counterparties. And things like bankruptcy is a great tool for buyers as well, because the buyers can basically pick and choose which contracts that they want to take by way of assignment. And so they get to look at these contracts. They have some time. Usually, they basically have a list that's attached to the APA, but that list can be changed between the date that the APA is signed up and the time that the deal actually closes. And so, burdensome contracts or contracts that you're not sure of, you could always, basically say, I'm not taking those, but you can minimize your liabilities. And so that there's things in terms of risk that you could try to minimize.
I think that's spot on. And the hallmark of due diligence is really managing your downside. Obviously, you're excited about the opportunity, but you want to try to canvas all the different areas as much as you can within the allotted time and try to get to a point where you feel comfortable and can protect against the future. Like Joe said, you want to be indemnified as much as possible and be able to get the assets as sanitized as possible. So moving back to a question from Bert again, asking essentially about multiples being frothy. When do the three of you think that distress M&A will come back again? Not what's the environment look like from your perspective?
Not cooling down. Multiples, we're seeing high multiples. We're doing large cash flow term loans on refinances. Businesses are growing. It's frothy out there.
Yeah, I agree with what Sharon's saying. And what I could say is this, and a lot of you who are listening will probably agree. When the pandemic started in early 2020, I think everybody expected a deluge of insolvencies and potential bankruptcies, and that actually happened for a short period of time. Bankruptcies ticked up in 2020, but things like the government giving PPP loans and injecting liquidity into the system, and most states putting moratoriums in effect with respect to foreclosure and commercial evictions and things like that, slowed things down from a bankruptcy / distressed situation. And so I do think that the market is very frothy. I think that M&A is generally pretty strong right now, and I think that distressed M&A is not so strong right now. And the economy goes up and down, and things will come back. I can't predict when, because I've been through various cycles over the years. But right now there's not a lot of activity when it comes to M&A work in a distressed or a bankruptcy situation.
Joe, I'm so glad you said that, because that's what I was going to talk about. Was I think there's a bit of, because of all that money that hit the markets and hit these companies, is one of the things that you really have to look at when you're looking at a company or an opportunity is what's their true operational run rate. So if you look at their working capital, how much of that working capital was infused by some of this grant money and PPP money and loan money, and what would their balance sheet look like without it, and how have they been running the last year, taking that aside? Because to Joe's point is, all that may have done is just push everything out a year or two, right? And so understanding how they're operating and what their balance sheet looks like without that money is also a great way to take a look at where they may be headed in the next 12, 24, 36 months.
Another question from the group here, this one from Martin, on the topic again of valuations. How will inflation and more expensive money affect distressed M&A and valuations?
I would thought Jeff would have grabbed onto that, but let me say this. only because you're the financial.
I'm deferring to the expert.
The so-called expert. I would think that, inflation will slow down the economy. And, while the economy is kind of chugging along right now and inflation is pretty high, and interest rates are still low, even though they've ticked up a bit. And so, I do think in time, the inflation will catch up and cause distress. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think another point there is when you think about the way inflation works in terms of supply chains being affected by inflation, and then thinking about how wages are being affected by inflation, over time, if you're not able to pass through price increases, regardless of what the business model is, you're going to see a decrease in your margins. And over time, that can lead to situations where you might need to take on more debt. And maybe, in a few years, depending on how things go with the Fed, if, to Joe's point, money gets more expensive or capital or financing gets more expensive, on average, businesses might be more highly levered, but that will lead to, depending on the environment, refinancings or maybe distress M&A, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, I would add, so I would add to that now that I got put on the spot by Joe. So Marty, I would say for me, right now I'm worrying less about inflation and the expense of money as I am about the labor market. For me, the labor market, when it relates to operationally running businesses, is some of the biggest risk that companies face right now, both from a margin perspective, and then having to pass those costs over to customers and how that may affect revenues, and also just from them actually affecting revenues because they can't find enough workers and the right people, and it's actually affecting their ability to sell. So right now, when I'm in with clients, that's one of the first things I take a look at is how strong is the human capital pool? Where are they at? What does their onboarding stuff look like? What's their projections for that, for headcounts and training and all of that? Because right now, I think that's a bigger risk to businesses than inflation. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and Jeff, to that, one of there's a few opportunities that we're working on the buy and the sell side at DAC where issues with finding labor is actually the gating factor in growth. So it's not necessarily demand driven, it's more supply driven. Yeah. And some of the companies that we work with are healthcare companies. So if you're working with like a med tech or a pharma company, you might need folks within engineering and R&D, and there's different roles that need to be filled. But within healthcare services, or certainly with hospitals, anecdotally, everyone's probably heard about staffing shortages. But we've been on calls from a due diligence perspective, and even buyers have admitted on the sell side that their biggest gating factor to growth is not getting referral of cases, whether they are, say, like offsite services in the form of home health care, or they're doing something within hospice. It's finding the right nurses or caregivers to actually staff the cases. If you have a manufacturing business, one of the issues that you might run into is finding workers just be on the line, or even freight deliveries because of the shortage in truck drivers. So there is something when you think about valuations from the buy side that is more industry specific, because if you're in an industry where there isn't some of these kind of recurrent issues as it relates to, say, like staffing, or like if you're in, say, like a food or consumer business and there's all these price increases because every part of the supply chain is being affected when it comes to food production, that's something that just factors into what you're going to pay for a business, because there are some, from a valuation perspective, brackets on what the growth can be. And it's a harder problem to solve because it might cut into margins if you get that growth. And then you have to ask yourself as a buyer, am I going to pay the same valuation? Am I going to pay less? Is there an earnout? What are the structures or mechanisms that I can put in place as a buyer to help kind of hedge against this? All right. So I think one other question from the crowd here from Bert, asking about, and this is probably for Jeff or Joe, when you're on the buy side, are there buyer pricing differences between a strategic acquisition where the company survives, or there's some type of carve out, versus a merger?
Yeah, so I guess the answer is certainly yes. you know, whether you're a strategic or financial buyer, you know, whether you're talking merger, I mean, obviously there's different implications if you're talking about a merger, and you know, whether it's a stock sale, you know, type thing versus an asset sale. There's all kinds of implications there, because you know, liability could run with a stock sale versus, you know, you can sanitize assets vis-a-vis an asset sale and things like that. But you know, I do think that those things certainly matter. And from the buyer's perspective, yeah, I think that you know, buyers often will try to run this through a bankruptcy process to both sanitize assets, to get things the way you want it. So hopefully that answers your question. I think that was Bert who asked it.
Yeah, I would just add, so from my perspective, how I look at it is, you know, from a merger, you're probably looking at owners of the target, you know, being more involved post transition, because part of their remuneration is going to be on some sort of earnout and their performance, whether their part of the business is carved out, however it's built. On the strategic side, there's obviously more appetite from the buyer to pay a little bit more than not. And what I wanted to mention there is, it also depends on, for me, it's the intellectual property, it's the IP and the intangibles that are part of that are in the business that obviously would need to be valued and understood, that aren't necessarily part of the day-to-day, but that's probably why they're looking at a company in distress to begin with. So I would, you know, when there's a company that has some sort of IP, whether they're building software, whether, you know, whatever it is, if it's brand related, if it's not destroyed, you know, usually strategic buyers are going to be paying more, and that spread is going to be dependent usually on the IP in the process.
Good points, Jeff. Pivoting to another area, coming back to Sharon for this question around financing or lending. And we talked about this a little earlier, but from a, you know, high level, you know, what are the steps in the financing process, specifically if you're on the buy side and you're looking to get funding from a bank? And what are some tips that you would recommend to advisors on the phone that might be working with someone now that needs to get funding for a distressed asset?
I would say that one of the time savers is if the investment banker who's involved in the deal has the package put together, and it's the text of the background, what happened, the history again, what happened, and why do you want to buy this business? What do you think you can do with the business? Why does it make sense for you? And for anyone who's buying a distressed business, we're looking for typically somebody who could write a check for the equity easily, and who could write a check further on if it doesn't turn in time. The timing of it all, as Joe spoke about, as Jeff spoke about, the timing of this is a little bit tricky because you have a ton of due diligence. On the legal side, hopefully the lender and all the attorneys get along very well to get that information, that there's no hidden liabilities out there, there's no contingents, there's nothing that can come back and bite you. One of the points that Jeff made, and I can't stress this enough, and it's something as a bank I can't do, they would never let me do it, so it has to be from an advisor, is what's the relationship with the trade? After the purchase, will the trade still support the company? If the trade takes a haircut, chances are they are not going to support this company, like to the ends of the earth. So you really want to make sure that there is a relationship with the trade so that they can continue functioning, and that the trade is not so irritated at the end of this process that they just walk away. The other part that I have to stress, and this takes time, and Jeff mentioned it again, is that 13-week cash flow. Because when he's finished with that one, and then it's like the 11th week of the 13th week, we want another one. And then we want another one. So it's going to be ongoing because we want to know what to expect. The worst thing in a turnaround situation is you've bet on the buyer and it doesn't work out. And then the banker is explaining to the credit committee, well, we thought that this was going to happen. We had all the support. They don't want to hear that. It's just what happened. So that's where having somebody like Jeff watching on a weekly basis really helps.
especially if they're independent, right? So to build off that and you know, to the the post transition is, if you're representing the buyer, right, is do they
Mhm.
have the internal capabilities to do some of this, a lot of this, all of this? Do they have a separate team? Melvyn does this every day,
Right.
so putting together, so talking about on the financing side with the lenders, putting together a package, right? That's, having that story, to Sharon's point, is, and that you've covered all the bases, is a level of comfort that goes above and beyond whatever the numbers say, because things
Mhm.
can go wrong. But having somebody in place who understands, what's going on and recognizes the risks, and then can kind of put it all together and make sure it happens, is critical. So, if you're representing just a strategic buyer and they haven't done this before, and they don't have maybe their internal team is strong, but they've never done this through a distress situation, you should be reaching out. If you have the team, great. But I think that's a key point as well.
Most people don't, Jeff.
I know.
They don't have the team. They don't have the patience. They're working on their next project. So this becomes old news. And then if something happens, they're catching up then.
The only thing I would add, and from the legal perspective,
Mhm.
obviously the lawyers are not the business people per se. That's why the team of professionals is important, because the bank is going to have a financial advisor, and there's going to be an investment banker perhaps involved. And so there's going to be some information depending on the situation and depending on the length of time here. But from the bank's perspective, obviously everything has to be properly perfected. And to the extent there's risk, there might have to be additional guarantees and additional collateral and things like that. So these are things that, all have to be discussed and considered from the bank's perspective.
And Joe, I just want to add to that also, and I'm sure you've seen this. If you're, usually the buyer's drafting, let's say it's the APA, let's say you're buying the assets. The time to collaborate and work together is in advance of drafting that APA, because the APA, for whatever, that needs to be legally tight, also has to reflect what the business is going to do going forward. So there's a bit of that component in there as well, is that if you're looking at how the business is operating and what's going to happen, it can be reflected in the APA, and the APA can be structured to support what the buyer intends to do strategically. So that's critical as well. I find during, on some of these due diligences and negotiations, is I work very closely with the lawyer as the document is being drafted. So.
And obviously, I'm sorry, Melvyn, I think you're about to say something, but
No, it's okay.
we're talking about perhaps two different things here. When you're talking about a distress situation, but you're talking about a distressed sale outside of a bankruptcy or some other type of insolvency proceeding, it's one thing. If you're talking about an APA in connection with the bankruptcy, it's a different thing, because a lot of these bells and whistles and things you might want to put into an APA as a potential buyer will not fly in a bankruptcy. And the more you add and the more protections you try to get could make it impossible or hard for a seller, target, debtor, whatever you want to call it, to accept and get the process move forward. And it will also make it a lot easier for you to get outbid by another bidder, because when you have all these like earn-out provisions and you want reps and warranties and things like that, and indemnity, those things don't usually fly in bankruptcy. And so if somebody else comes in and they make even a lower offer, but they don't contain those owner's provisions, their bid might be a better bid. So these are just things to consider.
Good points, Joe. And a quick follow-up from the crowd to Sharon. How often will the incumbent regulated lender stay attached?
What does that mean?
Bert?
Sharon, if you're involved in distressed M&A and
Hi,
the
Bert.
company already underperforming, is it likely that a regulated lender will stay attached and be the lender to the buyer as well?
I've seen that. I've seen both. I've seen where they've been through the distress. They trust the owner. The owner is honest. They believe that whatever happened was not really the owner's fault, so they'll stay on. And then in other cases, I've seen where they've just said, you have to leave. And when it's you have to leave, it usually means that something has happened where the level of trust is no longer there. I myself have never had that. I've always stuck with my companies, and through thick and thin, we've made it through. We've even avoided bankruptcy, and they're successful today, and they were later sold and for great multiples. But not every banker has the stomach to stick it out. I do, especially being an ABL lender.
You'll typically underwrite the buyer and stay with the company.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
I also think it depends on, what type of bank you're talking about. If you're talking about a smaller regional bank versus a larger bank, where as soon as there's distress, things get moved over to the workout section, and now you're dealing with different people. So, Sharon is not involved anymore per se, because the decision makers are in the workout group, and, they don't want any part of this buyer, of this company going forward. And if the buyer is going to hire the current management team of the target seller, that might not fly. So I think these are considerations, and depending on, what type of financial institution you're talking about.
Yeah, it's all the personalities, Bert. The better you get along with your bank, the better the outcome and the less expensive it is.
All right, so we've got a few minutes left here, and we have one last question, I think, that we discussed as a panel, but wanted to actually open it up to see if anyone else had questions in advance of that. All righty. So last question here. We've spent a lot of the time, pretty much all the time today, talking about the perspective of a buyer and what's the roadmap, what are some of the opportunities, the risks, and the pitfalls of buying distressed business. And I put this first to Joe. What's different when you're working with a seller in a distressed situation?
Yes. So when the board or the management team of a seller enters the zone of insolvency, as they call it in the legal world, the duties of the board change. And so instead of owing duties to your equity holders, you now perhaps owe duties to creditors. And so, as part of those duties, your goal and your duties are to maximize value. And so, you want to move forward and get the best price, because you don't want to be second guessed later on and somebody say that you did something wrong and you weren't trying to maximize value. And so you need to run a fulsome process if a sale is what's in the works, and things like certainty of a closing. So buyers who are offering things that potentially have contingencies or or illusory in some way, or offers that may not fly. So the most important thing is trying to maximize the value of the recovery for the creditors in that situation, and to maximize the value of, if in bankruptcy, for the estate, but generally speaking, for creditors.
Thank you, Joe. Jeff, Sharon, we're pretty much out of time here, but we've got 1 minute left. So speak now or forever hold your peace.
On the sell side, yeah, if you can, to Joe's point, obviously off the days, if you can, you have to try and control the confidentiality and control the process, even though you may not be in control. I was in a situation once where we had guys come in, do their due diligence, it was a strategic buyer, and somebody set up shop on our, in our offices for about a month. And after that month, there was still no offer coming in. There was nothing. They were learning our trade secrets. I kicked them out and parachuted somebody else in, and we did a deal 2 weeks after that. So controlling the due diligence on the sell side, as much control as you have, needs to be carefully looked at. By that time, you're probably out of any strategic abilities to control the process, but there are some things you still can control And my mentor taught me the best lie is the truth. In other words, don't sugarcoat anything, don't hide it. It is what it is. Be forthcoming with your information, and you know, your sell side due diligence in distressed companies is much different.
Jeff, can I use that line? The
It's
best
great,
lie is
right?
the truth.
It's
This is
great.
great.
It's the greatest line. And then the long way is the short way is my other one, because instead of just trying to piecemeal it together. But it's true. You still, everybody has reputations to consider, right? So nobody's gonna ruin their reputation for one deal or one thing, and you have to be forthcoming, and you're trying to manage 100 things and still run your own business, and you're grasping at straws, and you're taking meetings trying to find some equity or some debt to bide you some time, and it's really a very ugly situation. Usually you've got employees, morale's low, employees are leaving, they may be cut, so it's really a difficult time. But you got to try and control confidentiality as best you can, and control the flow of information as best you can too.
Jeff, I agree with you that from a professional advisor's perspective, you never want to put your reputation at issue for one deal. But I can tell you that there are professionals out there that do that. So
yes,
unfortunately,
not this professional.
Yeah.
High integrity on this call. With that, Matt, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thanks, everybody. Melvyn, Jeff, Joe, Sharon, really appreciate your insight and availability today. And I know everybody benefited from your expertise, and I can say that now after the call. So thank you. And just wanted to, anybody who wants to stick around for the next 15 minutes, we'll have some breakout groups and do some networking. If you have to jump, that's okay. But our next meeting will be April 6th. Be a peer share